Picture this. You're standing on the shore of what looks like paradise. Crystal clear waters stretch endlessly before you, warm currents dance beneath the surface, and life appears to flourish in every direction. But this isn't the ocean, you know. This is Earth 200 million years ago. And beneath those deceptively calm waters lurks a horror show that would make your worst nightmares seem like bedtime stories. Welcome to the most terrifying chapter in our planet's history, where the seas weren't just home to marine life. They were gladiatorial arenas where only the most ruthless, the most perfectly adapted killing machines could survive. This wasn't nature at its most beautiful. This was evolution at its most brutal, crafting monsters so terrifying that modern sharks would flee in terror. Today, we're diving deep into the prehistoric oceans that ruled our world for millions of years. We're talking about waters that were warmer, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous than anything that exists today. These ancient seas covered more of Earth's surface than our current oceans, creating vast underwater kingdoms where apex predators the size of school buses hunted with jaws that could crush cars and teeth longer than kitchen knives. But here's what makes this story truly spine-chilling. These weren't just random acts of violence. Every single creature that dominated these waters was a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, designed by millions of years of natural selection to be the perfect predator. We're talking about animals with bite forces that dwarf Tyrannosaurus rex, swimming speeds that put modern dolphins to shame, and hunting strategies so sophisticated they'd make military tacticians jealous. The creatures we're about to encounter didn't just live in these prehistoric oceans. They ruled them with an iron fist, or in this case, razor-sharp teeth and bone-crushing jaws. Some were ambush predators that could remain motionless for hours before striking with lightning speed. Others were pursuit hunters that could chase down prey across miles of open ocean, and a few were so massive that their mere presence would darken the waters around them, casting shadows that spelled doom for anything unfortunate enough to swim beneath. What's truly mind-blowing is how these ancient oceans operated as complete ecosystems of terror. Every level of the food chain was occupied by something that could kill you in a dozen different ways. The shallow coastal waters that we consider safe today were patrolled by crocodilian monsters, 40 feet long. The open ocean was ruled by marine reptiles that made killer whales look like goldfish. Even the deepest trenches harbored creatures so bizarre and deadly that paleontologists are still trying to understand how they functioned. And here's the kicker. These weren't isolated incidents or rare evolutionary experiments. These killing machines dominated the seas for tens of millions of years, proving that in the ancient world, being a gentle giant was a one-way ticket to extinction. Only the most aggressive, the most adaptable, and the most ruthlessly efficient predators survived long enough to leave their mark in the fossil record. The story we're about to tell spans over 200 million years of oceanic evolution, from the early experiments of the Triassic period through the apex predator paradise of the Cretaceous seas. We'll meet crocodilians that made modern crocodiles look like house pets, marine reptiles with necks longer than their entire bodies, and fish with spiral saws for jaws that could slice through anything in their path. But this isn't just a catalog of prehistoric monsters. It's a journey into a world so alien and terrifying that it challenges everything we think we know about life on Earth. These oceans operated under different rules, where size wasn't just an advantage, it was a necessity for survival, where having the strongest bite force in the animal kingdom might still not be enough to guarantee your next meal, where evolution didn't just favor the strong, it created weapons of mass destruction disguised as animals. The most incredible part of this story is how these creatures adapted to their environments in ways that seem almost impossible. We're talking about reptiles that gave birth to live young in the middle of the ocean, never needing to return to land. Marine predators that developed echolocation millions of years before dolphins, and hunters with sensory systems so advanced they could detect the electrical fields generated by their prey's heartbeat from hundreds of yards away. What makes these prehistoric seas truly nightmarish isn't just the individual monsters that called them home, it's how they all fit together in a perfectly balanced ecosystem of death. Every predator had its role, every hunting strategy filled a specific niche, and every evolutionary adaptation was a response to the constant arms race between predator and prey. The result was an oceanic environment so hostile and competitive that it pushed life to extremes we can barely comprehend today. As we explore these ancient waters, we'll discover that the line between predator and prey was constantly shifting. Today's apex predator could become tomorrow's lunch if it wasn't careful. Size alone wasn't enough. You needed speed, intelligence, powerful weapons, and most importantly, the killer instinct to use them without hesitation. The fossil evidence tells us a story of constant warfare, where bite marks on ancient bones reveal epic battles between titans, where the evolution of better armor led to the development of stronger jaws, which in turn led to faster swimming speeds, which drove the creation of more sophisticated hunting strategies. It was an evolutionary arms race that lasted for millions of years and produced some of the most incredible predators our planet has ever seen. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these prehistoric oceans was their sheer scale. We're not talking about a few isolated monsters lurking in the depths. We're talking about entire food webs dominated by creatures that would make great white sharks look like minnows. These weren't rare exceptions. They were the norm. The ancient seas were so filled with apex predators that being at the top of the food chain required constant vigilance and an unmatched capacity for violence. The environmental conditions that created these monster-filled seas were unlike anything we see today. The earth was warmer, the sea levels were higher, and the ocean chemistry was different. These conditions created the perfect storm for evolutionary experimentation, allowing life to explore forms and sizes that simply aren't possible in our modern oceans. What's truly remarkable is how these creatures managed to coexist in the same waters without driving each other to extinction. The answer lies in the incredible diversity of hunting strategies and prey preferences that evolved. Some specialized in crushing shellfish, others in catching fast-moving fish, and still others in taking down large prey through pack hunting or overwhelming size. The more we learn about these prehistoric oceans, the more we realize that they represent something unique in Earth's history, a time when the seas truly belonged to the predators. Modern oceans, as dangerous as they might seem, are actually relatively peaceful compared to the killing fields of the Mesozoic era. As we prepare to dive deeper into this underwater nightmare, remember that every creature we're about to encounter was real. These weren't mythical monsters or science fiction fantasies. They were living, breathing animals that ruled the seas with absolute authority. Their fossilized remains tell us stories of power, aggression, and evolutionary perfection that continue to amaze and terrify scientists today. The journey we're about to take will transport us to a world where survival meant being willing to kill or be killed every single day, where the gentle giants of today's oceans would have been easy prey for predators that viewed violence not as a last resort, but as a way of life, where the ocean depths held horrors that would make our worst fears seem tame by comparison. So take a deep breath, because we're about to plunge into the most dangerous waters our planet has ever known. Welcome to the prehistoric oceans, where nightmares came to life and only the most terrifying survived to tell their story through the fossil record. The reign of these oceanic monsters lasted for millions of years, but their legacy continues to haunt our understanding of what life on Earth can become when evolution unleashes its full creative potential for destruction. These weren't just animals. They were living weapons, honed by time and natural selection into the perfect instruments of aquatic warfare. The first nightmare to emerge from these ancient killing fields was a monster that redefined what it meant to be an apex predator. Imagine a crocodile, but strip away everything you think you know about size limitations. Picture jaws that could snap a car in half, teeth the size of bananas, and a body stretching longer than a city bus. This wasn't some mythical dragon. This was Deinosuchus, and it was absolutely real, living around 80 million years ago when the world was a greenhouse planet with no ice caps. Deinosuchus prowled waterways that stretched across what we now call North America. But calling it a crocodile is like calling a fighter jet a paper airplane. This beast measured up to 35 feet from snout to tail and weighed as much as a fully loaded truck. Its skull alone was longer than most people are tall, housing a bite force that scientists estimate reached 18,000 pounds per square inch. To put that in perspective, that's enough crushing power to snap a Tyrannosaurus Rex's leg bone like a toothpick. And we know this isn't just speculation, because paleontologists have found T-Rex bones with bite marks that match Deinosuchus' teeth perfectly. This crocodilian nightmare wasn't just sharing the same world as the most famous predatory dinosaur, it was actively hunting them. The hunting strategy of Deinosuchus was pure psychological warfare, like modern crocodiles but magnified to apocalyptic proportions. It would lurk just beneath the surface of rivers and coastal waters. Only its eyes and nostrils would break the waterline, creating the illusion of floating logs or debris. Dinosaurs approaching the water's edge for a drink would have no idea that death itself was watching them from just yards away. When the moment was right, Deinosuchus would explode from the water with the force of a missile launch. Its massive jaws would clamp down on whatever unfortunate creature had wandered too close, and from that moment the victim's fate was sealed. Those banana-sized teeth weren't designed for cutting. They were built for gripping and crushing. Once Deinosuchus had you in its grip, there was no escape. But the truly terrifying aspect of this predator was its intelligence. Modern crocodiles are already remarkably cunning hunters, capable of learning, problem-solving, and even using tools. Deinosuchus, with its massive brain case, would have been even more sophisticated. It could learn the drinking patterns of different dinosaur species, identify the safest approach routes, and even coordinate attacks with other members of its species. The fossil evidence suggests that Deinosuchus wasn't content to simply grab prey and drag it underwater. The bite marks on dinosaur bones show a pattern of systematic dismemberment, indicating that these massive predators had developed techniques for efficiently processing prey that was sometimes larger than themselves. They weren't just killing machines. They were butchers, capable of breaking down massive dinosaurs with surgical precision. What made Deinosuchus even more nightmarish was its incredible adaptability. While most crocodilians are limited to specific types of water bodies, Deinosuchus fossils have been found in environments ranging from freshwater rivers to saltwater coastal regions. This wasn't a specialist predator confined to a single habitat. It was a generalist capable of terrorizing any waterway it chose to call home. The sheer size of Deinosuchus also meant that it had virtually no natural predators as an adult. Once these monsters reached maturity, they sat at the absolute pinnacle of their food webs, answerable to nothing and no one. They were living fortresses, armed with the most powerful bite in their ecosystem and protected by armor-like scales that could deflect most attacks. But Deinosuchus was just the beginning of our journey into prehistoric horror. As we move from the coastal waters into the open ocean, we encounter creatures that make crocodilian nightmares seem almost quaint by comparison. The true masters of the ancient seas weren't bound by the limitations of shoreline hunting. They ruled the endless blue with grace, speed, and unimaginable ferocity. Enter the world of the marine reptiles, where evolution took the basic reptilian body plan and transformed it into something that belonged more in science fiction than natural history. These weren't land animals that occasionally ventured into water. They were fully aquatic predators that had completely abandoned terrestrial life in favor of oceanic domination. The plesiosaurs represent one of evolution's most successful experiments in aquatic adaptation. Picture a creature with a body like a barrel, 4 flippers instead of legs, and a neck that could stretch longer than a telephone pole. The most extreme examples, like Elasmosaurus, possessed necks containing over 70 vertebrae, allowing them to extend their heads almost 25 feet from their bodies. This bizarre anatomy wasn't some evolutionary mistake. It was a masterpiece of predatory engineering. That impossibly long neck functioned like a living fishing rod, allowing plesiosaurs to position their bodies far from their prey while their serpentine necks snaked through the water to deliver lightning-fast strikes. Imagine being a fish, swimming peacefully through what appears to be empty ocean, only to have a head full of razor-sharp teeth suddenly materialize from the blue void. The hunting strategy of long-necked plesiosaurs was pure psychological terror. They would cruise through the water column with their massive bodies hidden in the depths, while their necks moved independently through the shallows above. To potential prey, there would be no warning, no massive shadow approaching, just sudden, inescapable death striking from an impossible angle. But not all plesiosaurs followed this serpentine strategy. The short-necked varieties, known as pliosaurs, took a completely different approach to oceanic dominance. These were the wolves of the ancient seas, built for raw power and devastating speed. Creatures like Deadliest and Pliosaurus possessed skulls that could measure over 6 feet in length, filled with teeth the size of railroad spikes. Pliosaurs were pursuit predators, capable of chasing down prey across miles of open ocean. Their 4 massive flippers could propel them through the water at speeds that would make modern dolphins jealous, while their streamlined bodies cut through the waves with hydrodynamic perfection. When a pliosaur decided you were lunch, there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The bite force of the largest pliosaurs has been estimated at over 33,000 pounds per square inch, making them some of the most powerful biters in Earth's history. To put this in perspective, that's enough force to bite through a small car. Their jaws could open wide enough to swallow a great white shark whole, and their teeth were designed to punch through the thickest armor nature could devise. What made these marine reptiles truly terrifying wasn't just their individual capabilities, but how they worked together to dominate entire ocean ecosystems. The long-necked plesiosaurs controlled the middle depths, using their reach advantage to pick off smaller prey. The short-necked pliosaurs ruled the open water, chasing down anything fast enough to think it could escape. And in the coastal shallows, massive crocodilians like Deinosuchus ensured that even the water's edge offered no sanctuary. This wasn't a balanced ecosystem in any sense that we would recognize today. These were oceans where being at the top of the food chain required constant vigilance and an unmatched capacity for violence. Every day was a battle for survival, and only the most perfectly adapted killing machines lived to see another sunrise. The fossil record reveals a world of constant evolutionary arms races, where the development of better armor led to stronger jaws, which in turn drove the evolution of faster swimming speeds and more sophisticated hunting strategies. It was a perpetual cycle of escalation that pushed life to extremes we can barely comprehend. But the most disturbing aspect of these prehistoric seas wasn't the individual monsters that called them home. It was the realization that this was the natural state of oceanic life for millions of years. These weren't aberrations or evolutionary experiments gone wrong. This was simply what happened when evolution had unlimited time and resources to perfect the art of underwater predation. As we prepare to dive even deeper into this aquatic nightmare, remember that every creature we've encountered so far was just the beginning. The true horrors of the prehistoric oceans are still waiting in the depths, where creatures so bizarre and deadly evolved that modern science is still struggling to understand how they could have possibly existed. The reign of terror was just getting started, And the worst was yet to come. The deeper we venture into these prehistoric killing fields, the more we realize that the monsters we've encountered so far were merely the opening act. As we leave the familiar nightmare of crocodilian terror behind and plunge into the true heart of the ancient oceans, we enter a realm where evolution unleashed its most twisted creativity. Here, in the endless blue expanse of the Mesozoic seas, we meet creatures so perfectly adapted for destruction that they redefined what it meant to be a marine predator. Picture a world where the very concept of a fish was turned inside out and rebuilt from the ground up, where reptiles abandoned the land entirely and transformed themselves into living torpedoes designed for one purpose: to kill everything that moved in the water. This is where we encounter the ichthyosaurs, and trust me when I say that everything you think you know about marine predators is about to be shattered. The name ichthyosaur literally means fish lizard, but that description does absolutely no justice to these evolutionary marvels. Imagine taking a dolphin, stripping away every ounce of gentleness, and rebuilding it as a weapon of mass destruction. Then multiply its size by 10, give it jaws filled with teeth like railroad spikes, and program it with the hunting instincts of a great white shark on steroids. That's still not enough to capture the true horror of what these creatures represented. These weren't just big marine reptiles. They were evolutionary perfection, given flesh and bone. Over millions of years, natural selection had stripped away every unnecessary feature and refined every remaining trait for maximum lethality. Their bodies were streamlined to perfection, capable of slicing through water with less resistance than modern submarines. Their tails were crescent-shaped powerhouses that could propel them at speeds approaching 40 miles per hour, making them faster than anything else in their ancient seas. But speed was just the beginning of their arsenal. The largest ichthyosaurs stretched over 80 feet from nose to tail, making them longer than modern blue whales, but infinitely more dangerous. Their skulls alone could measure 15 feet in length, housing jaws that could open wide enough to swallow a small boat. And those jaws were lined with teeth that would make a great white shark weep with envy. Conical daggers designed to puncture, grip, and never let go. What made ichthyosaurs truly terrifying wasn't just their size or speed, it was their intelligence. These weren't mindless eating machines driven by instinct alone. Fossil evidence suggests they were capable of complex hunting strategies, possibly even coordinating attacks in groups. Imagine being surrounded by a pod of these monsters, each one the size of a sperm whale, but with the predatory instincts of a pack of wolves. Their sensory systems were equally nightmarish. Ichthyosaurs possessed the largest eyes of any known vertebrate, some measuring over a foot in diameter. These massive optical organs weren't just for show, they were precision instruments capable of detecting movement in the darkest depths of the ocean. Nothing could hide from an ichthyosaur, not in the brightest shallows or the blackest abyss. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of ichthyosaur biology was how completely they had adapted to aquatic life. Unlike modern marine mammals that still need to surface for air, these reptilian nightmares had evolved respiratory systems so efficient they could hold their breath for hours. They gave birth to live young in the open ocean, never needing to return to land for any reason. They were creatures of the deep, in the truest sense, owing no allegiance to the terrestrial world that had given birth to their ancestors. The hunting strategies employed by different ichthyosaur species read like a manual for underwater warfare. The smaller, more agile varieties were pursuit predators, capable of chasing down the fastest prey across miles of open ocean. Their acceleration was so rapid that they could go from motionless to full speed in seconds, turning them into living missiles that struck without warning. The larger species took a different approach. They were ambush predators of unimaginable patience. These giants would position themselves in the depths, using their massive size and dark coloration to blend with the shadows below. When unsuspecting prey passed overhead, they would rocket upward with explosive force, their enormous jaws opening to engulf victims that never saw death coming. But the true masters of ichthyosaur terror were the deep-water specialists. These creatures had evolved to hunt in the crushing depths where sunlight never penetrated, relying on senses we can barely comprehend. They could detect the electrical fields generated by their prey's muscle contractions, track the chemical signatures left by wounded animals, and navigate through absolute darkness with supernatural precision. The fossil record reveals that ichthyosaurs weren't content to simply dominate their own size class. They actively hunted other marine reptiles, including their own kind. Bite marks on ichthyosaur bones tell stories of cannibalistic violence that would make modern predators seem positively civilized. In the ancient oceans, even being an apex predator didn't guarantee safety from your own species. What's truly mind-boggling is how ichthyosaurs managed to coexist with the other marine nightmares of their time. The seas were already crowded with massive plesiosaurs, giant crocodilians, and creatures we haven't even discussed yet. Yet ichthyosaurs carved out their own niche and dominated it so completely that they ruled the oceans for over 150 million years. Their success wasn't just about individual prowess. It was about evolutionary innovation. Different ichthyosaur species had evolved specialized diets and hunting techniques that allowed them to exploit every available food source. Some crushed shellfish with powerful jaws. Others speared fast-moving fish with needle-like teeth. And the largest varieties took down prey that would challenge modern whales. The reproductive strategies of ichthyosaurs add another layer to their nightmare credentials. Unlike most reptiles that lay eggs, ichthyosaurs gave birth to fully formed young that were ready to hunt from the moment they entered the world. Fossilized birth scenes show baby ichthyosaurs emerging tail first, an adaptation that prevented drowning during the birthing process. From their very first breath, these creatures were programmed for violence. But as we continue our descent into prehistoric horror, we must acknowledge that ichthyosaurs, terrifying as they were, represent just one branch of the evolutionary tree of aquatic terror. The ancient oceans were vast enough to support multiple lineages of apex predators, each one perfectly adapted to exploit different aspects of marine life. Enter the Mosasaurus, creatures that took the concept of marine reptile and elevated it to an art form of destruction. If ichthyosaurs were the fighter jets of the ancient seas, then mosasaurs were the aircraft carriers, massive, heavily armed, and absolutely unstoppable. These weren't reptiles that had gradually adapted to aquatic life. They were land-dwelling lizards that had undergone one of the most dramatic evolutionary transformations in Earth's history. The largest mosasaurs stretched over 50 feet in length and possessed skulls that could measure 8 feet from tip to tip. But unlike the streamlined ichthyosaurs, mosasaurs retained a more lizard-like appearance, with powerful bodies, 4 flipper-like limbs, and tails that had been modified into massive swimming organs. They looked like dragons that had traded wings for fins, and they were every bit as terrifying as that description suggests. What made mosasaurs particularly nightmarish was their bite force. Scientists estimate that the largest species could generate crushing pressures exceeding 16,000 pounds per square inch, enough to snap a great white shark in half with a single bite. Their jaws were lined with recurved teeth designed to grip struggling prey, and their skull structure allowed them to open their mouths to impossible widths, much like modern snakes. The hunting strategy of mosasaurs was pure brute force intimidation. These weren't subtle predators that relied on stealth or speed. They were underwater bullies that used their massive size and overwhelming power to dominate everything in their path. When a mosasaur decided you were food, resistance was not just futile, it was impossible. But the most disturbing aspect of mosasaur biology was their adaptability. These creatures could thrive in any marine environment, from shallow coastal waters to the deepest ocean trenches. They ate everything: fish, other marine reptiles, seabirds, and even smaller mosasaurs. Nothing was safe from their appetites, and their global distribution meant that no ocean on Earth offered sanctuary from their presence. The fossil evidence reveals that mosasaurs weren't just successful predators. They were evolutionary perfectionists. Over the course of their reign, they developed increasingly specialized forms, with some species evolving crushing teeth for shellfish, others developing cutting teeth for large prey, and still others becoming pursuit predators capable of chasing down the fastest swimmers in their environment. As we witness the dominance of these marine reptilian nightmares, we begin to understand that the prehistoric oceans operated under fundamentally different rules than modern seas. These weren't ecosystems in any sense we would recognize today. They were gladiatorial arenas where only the most perfectly adapted killing machines could survive. The competition between different predator lineages drove an evolutionary arms race that lasted for millions of years. As ichthyosaurs developed better speed and maneuverability, mosasaurs evolved more powerful bites and larger sizes. As both groups became more efficient hunters, their prey species developed increasingly sophisticated defensive strategies, which in turn drove the predators to become even more deadly. This wasn't sustainable in any long-term sense, and the fossil record shows periods where the intensity of predation actually began to break down the basic structure of marine ecosystems. The ancient oceans were so filled with apex predators that they began to consume themselves, creating a spiral of violence that could only end in mass extinction. But before we reach that inevitable conclusion, we must explore the absolute pinnacle of prehistoric marine terror, deep in the ocean depths, where even ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs feared to venture. evolution was conducting its most twisted experiments. Here, in the crushing darkness of the abyss, creatures so bizarre and deadly evolved that modern science still struggles to understand how they could have possibly existed. The deep ocean trenches of the prehistoric world were home to predators so alien that they seemed to belong on another planet entirely. These weren't just big versions of familiar animals. They were evolutionary experiments that pushed the boundaries of what vertebrate life could become. And the most nightmarish of all was a creature whose very existence challenges our understanding of how predators should function. Imagine a shark, but strip away everything that makes a shark recognizable. Replace its normal jaws with the spiral saw made of teeth. Give it a body built for stealth rather than speed, and program it with hunting instinct so bizarre that paleontologists are still debating how it could have functioned. This was Helicoprion, and it represents the absolute peak of prehistoric marine horror. The name Helicoprion means spiral saw, and once you see what this creature looked like, you'll understand why. Instead of normal jaws, this nightmare possessed a lower jaw that had been transformed into a spiraling whirl of teeth, a living buzzsaw that grew continuously throughout the animal's life. As new teeth formed at the center of the spiral, older teeth were pushed outward, creating a cutting tool unlike anything else in the history of life on Earth. The mere existence of Helicoprion challenges everything we think we know about predatory anatomy. How does a creature with a spiral saw for a jaw actually catch and consume prey? How does it open and close its mouth? How does it swim without the saw interfering with its movement? These questions have puzzled scientists for decades, and the answers are more disturbing than you might imagine. Recent research suggests that Helicoprion used its tooth whorl like a living chainsaw, slashing through schools of soft-bodied prey with devastating efficiency. The spiral would rotate slightly as the jaw closed, creating a cutting action that could slice through multiple victims in a single strike. It wasn't hunting individual prey, it was harvesting them in bulk, turning feeding into an industrial process of destruction. The psychological impact of encountering a Helicoprion would have been beyond comprehension. Imagine being a fish swimming peacefully through what appears to be empty ocean, only to have a living buzzsaw suddenly materialize from the depths. There would be no escape, no defense, no hope of survival. The spiral would slice through everything in its path, leaving behind a cloud of blood and shredded remains. But Helicoprion wasn't the only deep-sea nightmare that haunted the prehistoric oceans. The crushing depths were home to creatures so bizarre that they seemed to belong in science fiction rather than natural history. These were predators that had evolved in environments where normal hunting strategies simply wouldn't work, forcing them to develop techniques so alien that we can barely comprehend them. The success of these deep-sea monsters reveals something truly disturbing about prehistoric marine ecosystems. They were so competitive and violent that even the most extreme evolutionary experiments could find a niche. The oceans were so filled with death and terror that creatures armed with spiral saws and other impossible weapons could not only survive, but thrive for millions of years. As we witness the full scope of prehistoric marine horror, we begin to understand that these weren't just dangerous animals. They were the products of evolutionary process is so intense and unforgiving that they created forms of life that shouldn't have been possible. The ancient oceans were laboratories of violence, where nature experimented with every conceivable method of killing, refining them over millions of years into instruments of perfect destruction. The reign of these marine monsters lasted for over 100 million years, creating oceanic ecosystems so hostile and competitive that they make modern seas seem like peaceful aquariums by comparison. Every square mile of water was patrolled by predators capable of killing anything they encountered, creating a world where survival required not just strength or speed, but an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection. But as we prepare to explore the final chapter of this underwater nightmare, we must confront the most disturbing truth of all. These creatures weren't anomalies or evolutionary mistakes. They were the natural result of millions of years of unrestricted predatory evolution, representing what happens when nature is given unlimited time and resources to perfect the art of killing. The story of prehistoric marine terror isn't just about the monsters themselves. It's about the world that created them, nurtured them, and allowed them to dominate for longer than mammals have existed on land. It's a reminder that the peaceful oceans we know today are a recent aberration in Earth's history, and that beneath the waves, the potential for horror still lurks in the depths of evolutionary possibility. The age of marine reptilian dominance was reaching its terrifying crescendo, but evolution wasn't finished with its underwater experiments. As we venture deeper into the Cretaceous period, we encounter creatures that pushed the very limits of what aquatic predation could become. These weren't just bigger versions of familiar monsters. They were evolutionary innovations so radical that they rewrote the rules of oceanic warfare. Deep beneath the surface, where sunlight had never penetrated and pressure could crush modern submarines, a new kind of nightmare was taking shape. This was the domain of Basilosaurus, a creature whose very name strikes fear into the hearts of paleontologists. King Lizard, they called it, though this title barely scratches the surface of what this monster truly represented. But here's where the story takes a twist that will challenge everything you thought you knew about prehistoric predators. Basilosaurus wasn't a reptile at all. It was a whale. Not the gentle giant kind of whale that filters krill through baleen plates, but a serpentine demon that stretched 60 feet from nose to tail and possessed jaws designed specifically for tearing apart large marine mammals. Picture a snake the length of a basketball court, but give it the intelligence of a mammal, the hunting instincts of an orca, and jaws filled with teeth like butcher knives. Basilosaurus represented evolution's most twisted experiment in mammalian predation, proving that when it came to creating oceanic nightmares, no animal group was exempt from the transformation. The hunting strategy of Basilosaurus was psychological torture elevated to an art form. Unlike the explosive ambush tactics of crocodilians or the high-speed pursuits of ichthyosaurs, this monster employed a technique that can only be described as aquatic terrorism. Its elongated, flexible body allowed it to move through the water like a living rope, undulating with movements so fluid and hypnotic that prey would be mesmerized until it was too late to escape. But the true horror of Basilosaurus lay in its intelligence. This wasn't some primitive killing machine driven by instinct alone. It was a thinking predator, capable of learning, planning, and adapting its strategies based on the behavior of its prey. Fossil evidence suggests that Basilosaurus could remember the migration patterns of other whales, anticipate their movements, and position itself for maximum killing efficiency. The jaws of Basilosaurus were engineering marvels of destruction, nearly 5 feet in length and armed with differentiated teeth designed for specific functions. They could both capture prey and systematically dismember it. The front teeth were designed for gripping and holding struggling victims, while the rear teeth functioned like serrated knives capable of slicing through blubber, muscle, and bone with surgical precision. What made Basilosaurus particularly nightmarish was its stamina. Modern predators are typically built for short bursts of explosive activity, followed by long recovery periods. But Basilosaurus was designed for persistence hunting. It could pursue prey across hundreds of miles of open ocean, never tiring, never giving up, always maintaining just enough distance to prevent escape, while gradually wearing down its victims through sheer psychological pressure. The fossil record reveals stomach contents that read like a catalog of marine horror. Basilosaurus didn't just hunt fish or squid. It actively preyed on other whales, including members of its own species. The bones of smaller cetaceans found within Basilosaurus specimens show clear evidence of systematic processing, indicating that these monsters had developed techniques for efficiently butchering prey larger than most modern cars. But Basilosaurus was operating in oceans that were already crowded with apex predators. The seas of the Eocene epoch were still home to massive marine reptiles, giant sharks, and other prehistoric nightmares. The fact that a mammalian predator could not only survive but dominate in this environment speaks to the incredible efficiency of its killing mechanisms. The sensory capabilities of Basilosaurus added another layer to its terror arsenal. While it lacked the echolocation abilities of modern toothed whales, it possessed extraordinary hearing that could detect the low-frequency sounds made by other marine mammals from hundreds of miles away. It was essentially a living sonar station, capable of tracking prey across vast distances and coordinating attacks with surgical precision. The reproductive strategy of Basilosaurus reveals just how completely it had adapted to a life of oceanic predation. Unlike modern whales that give birth to single calves and invest heavily in their care, Basilosaurus appears to have followed a more reptilian approach, producing multiple offspring and abandoning them to fend for themselves from birth. This meant that even baby Basilosaurus were born killers, forced to hunt or die from their first moments of life. As we witness the reign of these mammalian sea serpents, we begin to understand that the prehistoric oceans had become something unprecedented in Earth's history, a three-dimensional battlefield where predators from multiple evolutionary lineages competed for dominance. Reptiles, fish, and now mammals were all locked in an arms race that pushed each group to develop increasingly sophisticated killing techniques. But the story of prehistoric marine terror doesn't end with the giants we've encountered so far. In the deeper trenches and more remote ocean basins, evolution was conducting experiments so bizarre that they challenge our understanding of what vertebrate life can become. These were creatures that seemed to belong more in nightmares than in any recognizable ecosystem. The ancient oceans were vast enough to support predators so specialized that they occupied niches we can barely comprehend today. Some had evolved to hunt in complete darkness, relying on senses that have no modern equivalent. Others had developed body plans so unusual that paleontologists are still debating how they could have functioned in a marine environment. Among the most disturbing of these deep-sea nightmares was a group of creatures that had taken the concept of dental weaponry to its absolute extreme. These weren't just predators with big teeth. They were animals whose entire anatomy had been restructured around the concept of dental destruction. Their jaws had become weapons platforms. Their skulls had been reinforced to handle massive bite forces, and their entire lifestyle revolved around the efficient processing of prey through superior dental engineering. The fossil evidence reveals creatures with teeth so large and numerous that their skulls were more tooth than bone. Some possessed multiple rows of replacement teeth that grew continuously throughout their lives, ensuring that their weapons never dulled or broke. Others had developed specialized teeth for different functions: cutting teeth, crushing teeth, gripping teeth, turning their mouths into Swiss Army knives of destruction. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these dental nightmares was their hunting behavior. Unlike modern predators that typically kill their prey before consuming it, many of these ancient monsters appear to have fed on living victims. Bite marks on fossilized bones show patterns consistent with systematic dismemberment of struggling prey, indicating feeding behavior so brutal that they would make modern predators seem merciful by comparison. The psychological impact of these feeding strategies cannot be overstated. Imagine being pursued by a predator that doesn't just want to kill you. It wants to take you apart piece by piece while you're still alive. This wasn't just predation. It was torture, elevated to an evolutionary strategy. The success of these dental specialists reveals something deeply disturbing about prehistoric marine ecosystems. The competition for food was so intense that even the most extreme feeding strategies could find a niche. The oceans were so filled with prey that predators could afford to be wasteful, inefficient, and incredibly cruel in their hunting methods. As we explore these increasingly bizarre predators, we begin to realize that the prehistoric seas operated under fundamentally different principles than modern ecosystems. Today's oceans are governed by concepts like energy efficiency and ecological balance, but the ancient seas were ruled by a single principle: kill everything you can as efficiently as possible and never stop evolving better ways to do it. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalog of evolutionary experimentation gone mad. Creatures with jaws that could dislocate to swallow prey larger than themselves. Predators with multiple sets of functional teeth arranged in complex patterns. Animals whose entire digestive systems had been optimized for processing the bones and shells of armored prey. But the most nightmarish discovery of all was the realization that many of these extreme predators weren't solitary hunters. Fossil sites reveal evidence of group feeding behaviors, with multiple individuals working together to take down prey that would have been impossible for any single predator to handle. These weren't just killing machines. They were coordinated killing machines, capable of planning and executing complex hunting strategies that would challenge modern military tacticians. The social dynamics of these prehistoric predator groups add another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scenario. Imagine being surrounded by a pack of creatures, each one capable of killing you in dozens of different ways, all working together with the coordination of a SWAT team and the patience of professional assassins. The fossil evidence suggests that these group hunting behaviors weren't limited to a single species or family. Multiple lineages of prehistoric marine predators appear to have independently evolved pack hunting strategies, indicating that the pressure to develop more efficient killing techniques was so intense that it drove convergent evolution across entirely different animal groups. But as we witness the absolute peak of prehistoric predatory evolution, we must confront a sobering reality. These creatures weren't just successful killers, they were too successful. The fossil record reveals that by the end of the Cretaceous period, the oceans had become so dominated by apex predators that the basic structure of marine ecosystems was beginning to collapse. The problem wasn't that there weren't enough prey species, it was that there were too many different types of predators, each one so perfectly adapted for killing that they began to eliminate not just their prey, but each other. The ancient seas had become a victim of their own success, creating predatory pressures so intense that they were unsustainable in the long term. Evidence of this ecological breakdown can be seen in the fossil record, where bite marks on predator bones become increasingly common toward the end of the Mesozoic era. The apex predators had begun turning on each other with increasing frequency, driven by competition for dwindling resources and the evolutionary pressure to maintain their positions at the top of increasingly crowded food webs. The late Cretaceous oceans were becoming something unprecedented in Earth's history. Yes, ecosystems where being an apex predator was no guarantee of safety. Even the largest, most perfectly adapted killing machines lived in constant fear of being hunted by their competitors. The seas had become so dangerous that survival required not just the ability to kill, but the ability to kill while constantly watching for threats from every direction. This wasn't sustainable, and the fossil record shows clear evidence of ecosystem instability in the final million years before the Great Extinction. Predator diversity was declining. Prey species were becoming increasingly rare, and the delicate balance that had sustained these underwater kingdoms for millions of years was beginning to crumble. The ancient oceans were heading toward a reckoning that would reshape marine life forever. The age of the super predators was drawing to a close, not because they weren't successful, but because they had been too successful for their own good. The very efficiency that had made them the most terrifying creatures in Earth's history was about to become their ultimate weakness. But before we witness the end of this underwater reign of terror, we must explore one final aspect of prehistoric marine horror that challenges everything we think we know about predator-prey relationships. Deep in the fossil record, scientists have discovered evidence of creatures so bizarre and specialized that they represent the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary experimentation. These weren't just predators. They were living weapon systems designed by millions of years of natural selection to exploit specific weaknesses in their prey with surgical precision. They had evolved beyond simple killing into something that can only be described as biological warfare, turning predation into a science of systematic destruction. The story of these ultimate predators reveals the final chapter in our journey through prehistoric marine terror, a chapter that shows us just how far evolution was willing to go in its quest to create the perfect underwater killing machine. The final frontier of prehistoric marine horror takes us into realms so twisted that they challenge our understanding of what life itself could become. As we descend into the deepest chapters of this underwater nightmare, we encounter evolutionary experiments so radical that they seem to belong in the fevered dreams of science fiction writers, rather than the fossil record of our planet. These weren't just bigger, badder versions of familiar predators. These were creatures that had pushed the boundaries of biological possibility to their absolute limits, developing hunting strategies and anatomical features so bizarre that modern science is still struggling to understand how they could have functioned. They represent the ultimate expression of predatory perfection, refined over millions of years into forms that were more weapon than animal. The oceans of the late Paleozoic era witnessed the emergence of creatures that would make every monster we've encountered so far seem almost reasonable by comparison. In the crushing depths where pressure could implode modern submarines and darkness was absolute, evolution was conducting its most twisted experiments. Here, freed from the constraints of normal marine environments, life explored possibilities that bordered on the impossible. Among these deep-sea nightmares, one creature stands out as perhaps the most disturbing predator ever to patrol our planet's waters. Its very existence challenges everything we think we know about how jaws should work, how teeth should grow, and how predators should hunt. This was a creature so alien in its construction that when the first fossils were discovered, scientists couldn't even figure out which end was the head. Imagine a shark, but strip away every familiar feature and replace them with something from your worst nightmares. Give it a lower jaw that had been transformed into a spiraling buzz saw of teeth, growing continuously throughout its life like some organic chainsaw. Make it large enough to slice through multiple victims in a single pass, and program it with hunting instincts so efficient that it could harvest entire schools of prey in minutes rather than hours. This creature represents the absolute pinnacle of dental weaponry evolution. Its spiral jaw wasn't just a collection of teeth. It was a precision instrument of mass destruction, capable of rotating as it closed to create a cutting action unlike anything else in the history of life on Earth. The physics of how this weapon functioned are so complex that researchers are still debating the biomechanics involved. The hunting strategy employed by this living buzzsaw was industrial-scale slaughter. Rather than targeting individual prey like most predators, it had evolved to process entire schools of soft-bodied marine animals in single feeding events. The spiral would slice through densely packed victims like a farmer's scythe through wheat, leaving behind clouds of shredded organic matter that would feed scavengers for days. But the true horror of this creature lay not just in its killing efficiency, but in its apparent intelligence. Fossil evidence suggests it could track the migration patterns of its preferred prey, positioning itself along known routes to maximize the carnage when feeding opportunities arose. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, systematic predation elevated to an art form of destruction. The psychological impact of encountering such a creature would have been beyond comprehension. Modern prey animals have evolved sophisticated escape responses because they understand how normal predators hunt. But how do you escape from something that doesn't hunt individuals? It harvests everything in its path. There would be no evasive maneuvers, no defensive strategies, no hope of survival once the spiral began its deadly rotation. The success of this buzzsaw nightmare reveals something deeply disturbing about the competitive pressures in prehistoric oceans. The fact that such an extreme evolutionary experiment could not only survive but thrive for millions of years indicates that the ancient seas were so crowded with life that even the most bizarre killing methods could find profitable niches. But this spiral-jawed terror was just one member of a larger community of deep-sea monsters that had evolved hunting strategies so alien they seemed to belong on another planet. The crushing depths were home to creatures that had developed senses we can barely comprehend, weapons that defy biological logic, and feeding behaviors that make modern predators seem almost civilized by comparison. Some of these abyssal nightmares had evolved to hunt, using electrical fields, detecting the minute bioelectric signatures generated by their prey's nervous systems from vast distances. Others had developed bioluminescent lures so sophisticated they could mimic the appearance of harmless prey species, drawing victims close enough for instantaneous strikes. Still others had evolved bodies so flexible they could literally tie themselves in knots around struggling prey, creating living straitjackets of death. The diversity of these deep-sea predators reveals just how creative evolution could become when freed from normal environmental constraints. In the lightless depths where traditional hunting strategies simply wouldn't work, life had experimented with every conceivable method of detecting, capturing, and processing prey. The results were predators so specialized that they occupied niches we can barely imagine today. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these abyssal monsters was their apparent coordination. Fossil sites reveal evidence that multiple species of deep-sea predators would congregate at specific locations, possibly following chemical trails left by wounded prey or coordinating their hunting efforts to maximize efficiency. These weren't just individual killing machines. They were components of a larger predatory network that spanned entire ocean basins. The feeding behaviors documented in these deep-sea fossil sites read like descriptions of underwater horror films. creatures that would systematically strip the flesh from living prey, starting with the extremities and working inward to prolong the feeding process. Predators that would inject their victims with paralyzing toxins, keeping them alive but helpless, while consumption proceeded at a leisurely pace. Animals that had evolved to feed exclusively on the internal organs of their prey, leaving hollow shells of still living victims behind. But the most nightmarish discovery of all was the realization that many of these extreme feeding behaviors weren't just opportunistic, they were evolutionarily programmed. These creatures had developed specialized anatomical features specifically designed for prolonged torture of their prey, teeth that were designed to cause maximum pain without immediate death, digestive enzymes that could be injected into living victims to begin the feeding process from the inside out, sensory systems that allowed them to monitor their prey's vital signs and adjust their feeding behavior accordingly. The existence of such creatures forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about the nature of prehistoric marine ecosystems. These weren't just dangerous environments where death came quickly to the unlucky. They were realms where suffering had been weaponized and refined into an evolutionary strategy. The ancient oceans had become torture chambers where the capacity to inflict prolonged agony had become a competitive advantage. As we witness the absolute peak of predatory cruelty, we begin to understand that the prehistoric seas had evolved beyond simple predator-prey relationships into something far more sinister. These were ecosystems where the ability to cause suffering had become as important as the ability to kill efficiently, where evolutionary success was measured not just in terms of hunting effectiveness, but in terms of the capacity to extract maximum benefit from each victim through prolonged exploitation. The fossil record from this period reveals feeding sites that can only be described as underwater abattoirs, locations where multiple predator species would gather to systematically process large numbers of prey using techniques so brutal that they would make modern slaughterhouses seem humane by comparison. These weren't feeding frenzies driven by hunger. They were organized operations designed to maximize the extraction of resources from living victims. The social dynamics of these feeding aggregations add another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scenario. Different predator species appear to have developed specialized roles within these underwater processing operations. Some would capture and immobilize prey, others would begin the systematic dismemberment process, and still others would handle the final consumption phases. It was biological warfare elevated to an industrial scale. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these discoveries is what they reveal about the intelligence of prehistoric marine predators. The level of coordination and specialization documented in these fossil sites suggests cognitive abilities that rival or exceed those of modern social predators. These weren't just killing machines driven by instinct. They were thinking, planning, learning creatures capable of developing and refining complex hunting strategies over multiple generations. The implications of this intelligence are truly terrifying. Modern predators are constrained by their cognitive limitations. They hunt when hungry, kill when necessary, and generally follow predictable behavioral patterns. But the prehistoric marine predators had evolved beyond such simple motivations. They appear to have hunted for reasons that went beyond immediate nutritional needs, developing what can only be described as recreational killing behaviors. Evidence for this recreational predation can be found throughout the fossil record. Bite marks on prey bones that show no evidence of feeding attempts, partially consumed carcasses that were abandoned while still rich in nutritious tissue, killing sites where far more prey was dispatched than could possibly have been consumed by the predators present. These weren't the actions of animals driven by hunger. They were the behaviors of creatures that had learned to derive satisfaction from the act of killing itself. The psychological profiles of these prehistoric super-predators read like case studies in sociopathic behavior. They displayed all the classic traits: lack of empathy for their victims, tendency toward excessive violence, apparent enjoyment of causing suffering, and complete disregard for the welfare of other living beings. The difference was that these traits had been refined by millions of years of natural selection into perfect instruments of biological terrorism. As we approach the climax of this underwater reign of terror, we must confront the ultimate question. How did ecosystems dominated by such creatures manage to function at all? The answer lies in the sheer abundance of life in the prehistoric oceans. The seas were so teeming with organisms that even the most wasteful and cruel predatory behaviors could be sustained by the constant influx of new victims. But this abundance came at a terrible cost. The fossil record reveals that by the height of the predatory arms race, entire regions of the ocean had been essentially stripped of complex life. The super-predators had become so efficient at killing that they were beginning to eliminate not just their preferred prey species, but entire ecological communities. The ancient seas were becoming biological deserts, maintained only by the constant immigration of organisms from less heavily predated areas. The late stages of this predatory escalation reveal something truly horrifying about the direction in which evolution was heading. The most successful predators were no longer those that killed most efficiently. They were those that could extract the maximum benefit from each kill through prolonged exploitation of living victims. The evolutionary pressure was selecting for creatures that were not just deadly, but actively cruel. This escalation of cruelty wasn't sustainable in any long-term sense. The fossil record shows clear evidence that by the end of the Mesozoic era, the marine predatory complex had become so extreme that it was beginning to consume itself. Predator-on-predator violence was becoming increasingly common as the traditional prey base collapsed under the pressure of overexploitation. The final chapters of prehistoric marine predation read like accounts of a civilization destroying itself through its own success. The super-predators had become so perfectly adapted for killing that they could no longer coexist with each other or with the ecosystems that supported them. The ancient oceans were heading toward a collapse that would reshape marine life forever. Evidence of this impending ecological catastrophe can be seen in fossil sites from the latest Cretaceous period. predator diversity was crashing as the most extreme specialists began to eliminate each other through direct competition. Prey species were becoming increasingly rare and small, forcing predators to turn on progressively smaller targets until they were competing for resources that couldn't sustain their massive energy requirements. The behavioral changes documented in these final fossil assemblages are particularly disturbing. Predators that had previously specialized in hunting specific prey types were becoming increasingly opportunistic, attacking anything that moved regardless of whether it provided adequate nutrition. Creatures that had evolved for open ocean hunting were moving into shallow coastal areas, disrupting established ecological relationships and creating cascading effects throughout marine food webs. Perhaps most tellingly, the fossil record shows increasing evidence of cannibalistic behavior among the superpredators. Species that had never shown intraspecific aggression were beginning to prey on their own kind with increasing frequency. The ancient oceans were becoming so depleted of traditional prey that even the most successful predators were being forced to turn on each other for survival. The final stages of this underwater apocalypse reveal predatory behavior so desperate and extreme that they beg a description. Creatures that had once been apex predators were resorting to scavenging, necrophagy, and increasingly bizarre feeding strategies as their traditional prey base collapsed around them. The magnificent killing machines that had ruled the seas for millions of years were being reduced to opportunistic scavengers, fighting over the scraps of a dying ecosystem. But even as we witness the collapse of these prehistoric predatory empires, we must acknowledge their incredible success. For over 100 million years, these creatures had dominated the largest habitat on Earth, creating ecosystems so hostile and competitive that they pushed the boundaries of what life itself could become. They had transformed the oceans into gladiatorial arenas where only the most perfectly adapted killing machines could survive. And in doing so, they had created some of the most remarkable predators in the history of our planet. The legacy of these underwater nightmares extends far beyond their own extinction. The evolutionary pressures they created shaped the development of marine life in ways that continue to influence ocean ecosystems today. Modern prey species still carry the genetic memories of their ancestors' encounters with these prehistoric terrors, and their defensive strategies reflect millions of years of coevolution with predators that were literally designed for destruction. As we prepare to witness the final chapter of this aquatic reign of terror, we must remember that these weren't just animals. They were evolutionary masterpieces, refined by natural selection into instruments of biological warfare so perfect that they ultimately became victims of their own success. Their story serves as a reminder of what happens when evolutionary arms races are allowed to proceed without limits, and of the incredible creativity that nature can display when freed from normal constraints. The age of the super predators was drawing to a close, but their impact on the history of life would endure forever. They had proven that, given enough time and the right conditions, Evolution could create creatures so perfectly adapted for killing that they transcended the normal boundaries between predator and weapon. They were living proof that in the endless struggle for survival, nature was willing to experiment with forms of life so extreme that they challenged our understanding of what was biologically possible. The prehistoric oceans had been transformed into something unprecedented in Earth's history, a three-dimensional battlefield where the capacity for violence had been elevated to an art form. And now, as we stand on the threshold of their final chapter, we prepare to witness how even the most perfect killing machines can be brought low by the very success that made them invincible. The end was coming, but it would not come gently. The collapse of these predatory empires would be as spectacular and violent as their rise to power, reshaping the oceans forever and setting the stage for the emergence of entirely new forms of marine life. The age of underwater nightmares was about to give way to something completely different, but the echoes of their reign would continue to haunt the depths for millions of years to come. The twilight of the underwater titans was approaching, but before we witness their final moments, we must explore one last horror that epitomizes everything terrifying about these prehistoric seas. Deep in the fossil record lies evidence of a creature so perfectly engineered for aquatic dominance that it represents the absolute pinnacle of mammalian predatory evolution. This was no ordinary whale. This was Basilosaurus, a serpentine nightmare that stretched 60 feet through the ancient waters like a living torpedo of destruction. But unlike the gentle giants that populate our modern oceans, this monster was built for one purpose: systematic annihilation of everything that dared to share its domain. Picture a creature that combined the intelligence of a dolphin with the predatory instincts of a great white shark. Then multiply that horror by 10 and stretch it into a form so alien that it defied every rule of mammalian anatomy. Basilosaurus possessed a body plan that seemed more reptilian than mammalian, an elongated, flexible spine that allowed it to undulate through the water with movements so fluid they were almost hypnotic. The skull of this aquatic demon measured nearly 5 feet in length, housing a brain sophisticated enough to plan complex hunting strategies and jaws powerful enough to crush the bones of prey larger than modern cars. But what made Basilosaurus truly terrifying wasn't just its size. It was the surgical precision with which it dismembered its victims. The teeth of Basilosaurus were differentiated tools of destruction, each type designed for a specific function in the systematic processing of prey. The front teeth were needle-sharp daggers designed for puncturing and gripping struggling victims. The rear teeth were serrated cutting implements that could slice through blubber, muscle, and bone with the efficiency of industrial machinery. Fossil evidence reveals stomach contents that read like a catalog of marine carnage. Basilosaurus didn't just hunt fish or squid. It actively preyed on other whales, including members of its own species. The bones found within these prehistoric killers show clear evidence of methodical dismemberment, indicating that these creatures had developed techniques for efficiently butchering prey that would challenge modern surgical procedures. The hunting strategy of Basilosaurus was persistence predation elevated to an art form of psychological warfare. Unlike modern predators that rely on explosive bursts of speed, this monster was built for endurance. It could pursue prey across hundreds of miles of open ocean, maintaining a steady pace that gradually wore down its victims through sheer relentless pressure. Imagine being hunted by something that never tired, never gave up, never showed mercy. A creature that could track your movements across vast distances, anticipate your escape routes, and adjust its strategy based on your behavior. This wasn't just predation. It was aquatic terrorism conducted by an intelligence that understood exactly how to maximize fear and suffering. The sensory capabilities of Basilosaurus were equally nightmarish. Its hearing was so acute that it could detect the distress calls of wounded marine mammals from hundreds of miles away, turning the ocean into a vast network of suffering that it could monitor and exploit. Every cry of pain, every struggle for survival became a dinner bell, calling this monster to the feast. But Basilosaurus was operating in seas that were already crowded with apex predators from multiple evolutionary lineages. The fact that a mammalian predator could not only survive but dominate in this environment speaks to the incredible efficiency of its killing mechanisms and the sophisticated intelligence that guided them. The reproductive strategy of Basilosaurus reveals just how completely it had adapted to a life of oceanic predation. Unlike modern whales that invest heavily in raising single offspring, this monster appears to have produced multiple young and abandoned them to fend for themselves from birth. This meant that even baby Basilosaurus were born killers, forced to develop predatory skills or die within their first hours of life. The social dynamics of these creatures add another layer of horror to their already nightmarish existence. Evidence suggests that adult Basilosaurus would sometimes hunt in loose coordination, using their superior intelligence to herd prey into killing zones where escape became impossible. These weren't just individual monsters, they were components of a larger predatory network that could span entire ocean basins. As we witness the dominance of these mammalian sea serpents, we begin to understand that the prehistoric oceans had become something unprecedented in Earth's history. A three-dimensional war zone where predators from completely different evolutionary backgrounds were locked in competition for the same resources. But the true masters of prehistoric marine terror weren't content to simply dominate their own size classes. The fossil record reveals evidence of creatures so bizarre and specialized that they challenge our understanding of what vertebrate predators could become. These were animals that had pushed the boundaries of biological possibility to their absolute limits. Among the most disturbing of these evolutionary experiments was a lineage of cartilaginous fish that had transformed their feeding apparatus into something that belonged more in a horror movie than in any natural ecosystem. These creatures had taken the concept of dental weaponry and elevated it to levels that defy rational explanation. Helicoprion represents the absolute pinnacle of this dental arms race. This wasn't just a shark with big teeth. It was a creature whose entire lower jaw had been transformed into a spiraling buzzsaw of destruction. As new teeth formed at the center of this whirl, older teeth were pushed outward along the spiral, creating a cutting implement that grew continuously throughout the animal's life. The mechanics of how this living chainsaw functioned are so complex that scientists are still debating the physics involved. The leading theory suggests that the spiral could rotate slightly as the jaw closed, creating a cutting action that could slice through multiple victims in a single strike. This wasn't hunting in any conventional sense. It was harvesting, turning feeding into an industrial process of mass destruction. The hunting strategy employed by Helicoprion was unlike anything else in the history of predation. Rather than targeting individual prey items, this monster had evolved to process entire schools of soft-bodied marine animals in single feeding events. The spiral would slice through densely packed victims like a farmer's scythe through grain, leaving behind clouds of organic debris that would feed scavengers for days. But the true horror of Helicoprion lay in its apparent intelligence and planning ability. Fossil evidence suggests it could track the migration patterns of its preferred prey species, positioning itself along known routes to maximize carnage when feeding opportunities arose. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, systematic slaughter conducted with the precision of a military operation. The psychological impact of encountering such a creature would have been beyond comprehension. Modern prey animals have evolved sophisticated escape responses because they understand how normal predators hunt. But how do you escape from something that doesn't hunt individuals? It harvests everything in its path. There would be no evasive maneuvers, no defensive strategies, no hope of survival once the spiral began its deadly rotation. The success of this buzz saw Nightmare reveal something deeply disturbing about the competitive pressures in prehistoric oceans. The fact that such an extreme evolutionary experiment could not only survive but thrive for millions of years indicates that the ancient seas were so crowded with life that even the most bizarre killing methods could find profitable niches. As we explore these increasingly alien predators, we begin to realize that the prehistoric oceans had become testing grounds for evolutionary experiments so radical that they pushed life itself to its breaking point. These weren't just dangerous animals. They were biological weapon systems refined by millions of years of natural selection into instruments of perfect destruction. The deep ocean trenches of the prehistoric world harbored creatures so specialized that they occupied niches we can barely comprehend today. Some had evolved to hunt using electrical fields, detecting the minute bioelectric signatures generated by their prey's nervous systems from vast distances. Others had developed bioluminescent lures so sophisticated they could mimic the appearance of harmless species, drawing victims close enough for instantaneous strikes. The diversity of hunting strategies documented in the fossil record reads like a manual for biological warfare. Creatures that would inject their victims with paralyzing toxins, keeping them alive but helpless, while consumption proceeded at a leisurely pace. Predators that had evolved to feed exclusively on the internal organs of their prey, leaving hollow shells of still living victims behind. Animals whose digestive enzymes could be injected into living targets to begin the feeding process from the inside out. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these discoveries is what they reveal about the intelligence of prehistoric marine predators. The level of coordination and specialization documented in fossil sites suggests cognitive abilities that rival or exceed those of modern social predators. These weren't just killing machines driven by instinct. They were thinking, planning, learning creatures capable of developing and refining complex hunting strategies over multiple generations. Evidence for this advanced intelligence can be found in feeding sites that can only be described as underwater processing facilities, locations where multiple predator species would gather to systematically dismember large numbers of prey using techniques so organized that they resembled industrial operations more than natural feeding behaviors. Different predator species appear to have developed specialized roles within these processing operations. Some would capture and immobilize prey, others would begin the systematic dismemberment process, and still others would handle the final consumption phases. It was biological warfare elevated to an industrial scale, conducted with a level of organization that challenges our understanding of prehistoric animal intelligence. But perhaps the most chilling discovery of all was the realization that many of these extreme feeding behaviors weren't just opportunistic. They were evolutionarily programmed. These creatures had developed specialized anatomical features specifically designed for prolonged exploitation of their victims. Teeth that were designed to cause maximum suffering without immediate death. Sensory systems that allowed them to monitor their prey's vital signs and adjust their feeding behavior accordingly. The existence of such creatures forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of prehistoric marine ecosystems. These weren't just dangerous environments where death came quickly to the unlucky. They were realms where the capacity to inflict prolonged suffering had become a competitive advantage. The ancient oceans had evolved beyond simple predator-prey relationships into something far more sinister. As we witness these increasingly extreme adaptations, we begin to understand that the prehistoric seas had become something unprecedented in Earth's history. Ecosystems where the ability to cause suffering had become as important as the ability to kill efficiently, where evolutionary success was measured not just in terms of hunting effectiveness, but in terms of the capacity to extract maximum benefit from each victim through systematic exploitation. The behavioral changes documented in the latest fossil assemblages reveal predators that had evolved beyond normal motivations. Evidence suggests they hunted not just when hungry, but for reasons that went beyond immediate nutritional needs. Bite marks on prey bones show no evidence of feeding attempts. Partially consumed carcasses were abandoned while still rich in nutritious tissue. Killing sites contained far more dispatched prey than could possibly have been consumed by the predators present. These weren't the actions of animals driven by hunger. They were the behaviors of creatures that had learned to derive satisfaction from the act of killing itself. The psychological profiles of these prehistoric super-predators displayed all the classic traits of sociopathic behavior: lack of empathy for victims, tendency toward excessive violence, apparent enjoyment of causing suffering, and complete disregard for the welfare of other living beings. The final stages of this predatory escalation reveal something truly horrifying about the direction in which evolution was heading. The most successful predators were no longer those that killed most efficiently. They were those that could extract maximum benefit from each kill through prolonged exploitation of living victims. The evolutionary pressure was selecting for creatures that were not just deadly, but actively cruel. This escalation of cruelty wasn't sustainable in any long-term sense. The fossil record shows clear evidence that by the end of the Mesozoic era, the marine predatory complex had become so extreme that it was beginning to consume itself. Predator-on-predator violence was becoming increasingly common as the traditional prey base collapsed under the pressure of systematic overexploitation. Evidence of this impending ecological catastrophe can be seen in fossil sites from the latest Cretaceous period. Predator diversity was crashing as the most extreme specialists began eliminating each other through direct competition. Prey species were becoming increasingly rare and small, forcing predators to turn on progressively smaller targets until they were competing for resources that couldn't sustain their massive energy requirements. The behavioral changes documented in these final fossil assemblages are particularly disturbing. Predators that had previously specialized in hunting specific prey types were becoming increasingly opportunistic, attacking anything that moved regardless of whether it provided adequate nutrition. Creatures that had evolved for open ocean hunting were moving into shallow coastal areas, disrupting established ecological relationships and creating cascading effects throughout marine food webs. Perhaps most tellingly, the fossil record shows increasing evidence of cannibalistic behavior among the superpredators. Species that had never shown intraspecific aggression were beginning to prey on their own kind with increasing frequency. The ancient oceans were becoming so depleted of traditional prey that even the most successful predators were being forced to turn on each other for survival. The magnificent killing machines that had ruled the seas for millions of years were being reduced to opportunistic scavengers fighting over the scraps of a dying ecosystem. The very efficiency that had made them the most terrifying creatures in Earth's history was about to become their ultimate weakness. But even as we witness the approaching collapse of these predatory empires, we must acknowledge their incredible evolutionary achievement. For over 100 million years, these creatures had dominated the largest habitat on Earth, creating ecosystems so hostile and competitive that they pushed the boundaries of what life itself could become. The prehistoric oceans had been transformed into something unprecedented in Earth's history, gladiatorial arenas, where the capacity for violence had been elevated to an art form. These weren't just dangerous waters. They were three-dimensional battlefields where every cubic meter was contested by predators so perfectly adapted for killing that they had transcended the normal boundaries between animal and weapon. The legacy of these underwater nightmares extends far beyond their own extinction. The evolutionary pressures they created shaped the development of marine life in ways that continue to influence ocean ecosystems today. Modern prey species still carry genetic memories of their ancestors' encounters with these prehistoric terrors, and their defensive strategies reflect millions of years of coevolution with predators that were literally designed for destruction. As the age of super predators drew to its inevitable close, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic ecological transformations in Earth's history. The creatures that had ruled the seas with absolute authority for longer than mammals have existed on land were about to face a reckoning that would reshape marine ecosystems forever. The end would not come gradually or gently. When the collapse arrived, it would be as spectacular and violent as the rise of these underwater titans had been. The very oceans that had nurtured these evolutionary masterpieces would become their tomb, as changing conditions and catastrophic events conspired to bring down empires that had seemed invincible for millions of years. But that is a story for our final chapter, where we will witness how even the most perfect killing machines can be brought low by forces beyond their control, and how the end of one age of terror set the stage for the emergence of entirely new forms of marine life. The echoes of their reign would continue to haunt the depths for millions of years to come, a reminder of what happens when evolution is given unlimited time to perfect the art of underwater warfare. The dawn of the final act in this underwater apocalypse arrived not with a whisper, but with the thunderous collapse of ecosystems that had seemed eternal. As we stand witness to the twilight hours of the greatest predatory empire our planet has ever known, we must confront a truth more terrifying than any single monster. Even perfect killing machines are not immune to the forces that shape our world. The late Cretaceous oceans were reaching a breaking point that had been building for millions of years. The very success of these aquatic titans was becoming their greatest weakness, as the relentless arms race between predator and prey pushed marine ecosystems beyond their natural limits. The seas that had once teemed with endless abundance were beginning to show signs of strain under the pressure of systematic overexploitation. But before we witness the final chapter of this underwater reign of terror, we must explore the most chilling aspect of prehistoric marine predation: the creatures that had evolved beyond the need for traditional hunting strategies entirely. These weren't just apex predators. They were evolutionary aberrations that had transcended normal biological limitations to become something that challenged the very definition of what an animal could be. Deep in the fossil record lies evidence of creatures so specialized that they occupied niches which seem impossible by modern standards. These were predators that had abandoned conventional anatomy in favor of body plans so radical that paleontologists are still struggling to understand how they could have functioned in any recognizable ecosystem. Among the most disturbing of these evolutionary experiments were creatures that had weaponized their entire skeletal structure. Unlike normal predators that relied on teeth and claws, these monsters had transformed their bones into cutting instruments, their spines into whips of destruction, and their skulls into battering rams capable of punching through the strongest natural armor. The fossil evidence reveals predators whose rib cages had been modified into cage-like traps that could expand to engulf prey larger than the predator itself. Creatures whose vertebrae had developed razor-sharp edges that could slice through victims as the animal's body undulated through the water. Monsters whose skull bones had grown into elaborate horn formations designed not for display, but for systematic impalement of struggling prey. But perhaps the most nightmarish discovery was the realization that these skeletal weapons weren't random evolutionary accidents. They were precision instruments that had been refined over millions of years for maximum lethality. X-ray analysis of fossilized bones reveals internal structures so complex that they resembled engineered weapons more than natural anatomy. The hunting strategies employed by these bone-weaponized nightmares were unlike anything documented in modern ecosystems. Some would use their modified skeletons like living bear traps, positioning themselves in narrow passages and waiting for prey to swim into their deadly embrace. Others had evolved to hunt in coordinated packs, using their skeletal weapons in combination to create killing fields from which escape was impossible. The psychological impact of these creatures on their prey would have been beyond calculation. Modern animals can learn to recognize and avoid dangerous predators because they understand the visual cues that signal threat. But how do you recognize a predator that has abandoned normal predatory anatomy entirely? How do you escape from something that looks like harmless debris until the moment it transforms into a weapon of destruction? The success of these skeletal nightmares reveals something deeply disturbing about the competitive pressures in late Cretaceous oceans. The traditional predatory niches had become so crowded that evolution was being forced to explore increasingly bizarre alternatives. The seas were so filled with conventional apex predators that survival required abandoning conventional predatory strategies entirely. As these skeletal weapons reached the peak of their evolutionary development, they began to encounter prey that had evolved equally extreme defensive measures. The late Cretaceous saw the emergence of marine organisms with armor so sophisticated that it challenged the effectiveness of even the most advanced predatory weapons. This triggered an escalation that pushed both predator and prey to biological extremes that were ultimately unsustainable. The fossil record from this period reveals creatures whose shells had been reinforced with metallic compounds extracted from deep-sea vents. Prey species that had developed active camouflage systems capable of matching any background. Defensive organisms that could generate electrical fields powerful enough to stun approaching predators. The ancient oceans had become an evolutionary battlefield where the line between biology and technology was becoming increasingly blurred. But the most chilling development was the emergence of prey species that had evolved beyond simple defense into active retaliation. These weren't just armored creatures that could survive predatory attacks. They were organisms that had developed the ability to fight back with devastating effectiveness. The predator-prey relationship was breaking down as victims became capable of inflicting fatal damage on their attackers. The psychological warfare that characterized late Cretaceous marine ecosystems reached levels that seem almost incomprehensible by modern standards. Prey species had evolved the ability to mimic the appearance and behavior of dangerous predators turning the hunters into the hunted. Some had developed chemical weapons that could be deployed against attacking predators, transforming peaceful herbivores into living chemical warfare platforms. The most disturbing example of this defensive escalation was the evolution of prey species that had learned to exploit the hunting behaviors of their predators against them. These creatures could trigger predatory responses in their attackers, then use the predictable attack patterns to deliver devastating counterstrikes. The hunters were becoming victims of their own perfected killing instincts. As the arms race between predator and prey reached its crescendo, the fundamental structure of marine ecosystems began to collapse under the strain. The energy costs of maintaining such extreme adaptations were becoming prohibitive, forcing both predators and prey to invest so much in offensive and defensive capabilities that they had little energy left for basic survival functions. The fossil record reveals populations of super predators that were literally starving to death despite being surrounded by potential prey. Their weapons had become so specialized that they could only process specific types of victims, but those prey species had evolved defenses that made them essentially impossible to capture. The perfect killing machines had become victims of their own evolutionary success. Evidence of this ecological breakdown can be seen in bone chemistry analysis from late Cretaceous fossils. Predator species show signs of chronic malnutrition despite living in apparently abundant environments. Stress indicators in fossilized tissues suggest that these apex predators were living in constant states of near starvation, their metabolic demands outstripping their ability to acquire adequate nutrition. The social structures that had allowed complex predatory behaviors were beginning to collapse as individual survival became increasingly difficult. Pack hunting behaviors documented earlier in the fossil record disappeared during this period, replaced by increasingly desperate solo hunting attempts. The sophisticated coordination that had made these creatures so effective was breaking down under the pressure of resource scarcity. Perhaps most tellingly, the fossil record shows increasing evidence of predators attempting to hunt prey that was completely inappropriate for their specialized anatomy. Creatures that had evolved to hunt specific prey types were making increasingly desperate attempts to capture anything that moved, regardless of whether their weapons were designed for such targets. The results were often fatal for both predator and prey. The final stages of this ecological collapse reveal behavior so desperate that they challenge our understanding of predatory psychology. Creatures that had been apex predators for millions of years were resorting to scavenging, necrophagy, and increasingly bizarre feeding strategies as their traditional prey base collapsed around them. The magnificent hunters of the ancient seas were being reduced to opportunistic scavengers, fighting over the scraps of a dying ecosystem. But even as we witness the approaching end of this underwater empire, we must acknowledge the incredible evolutionary achievement these creatures represented. They had pushed the boundaries of what vertebrate predators could become, exploring biological possibilities that seem almost science fictional by modern standards. Their very existence had reshaped the oceans into something unprecedented in Earth's history. The influence of these super predators extended far beyond their immediate ecosystem impacts. Their presence had driven the evolution of prey species in directions that would have been impossible under normal predatory pressure. The defensive innovations that emerged during this period would influence marine evolution for millions of years after the predators themselves had vanished. The reproductive strategies that had allowed these creatures to maintain their populations were also beginning to fail under the pressure of resource scarcity. Species that had produced large numbers of offspring were finding that juvenile survival rates were plummeting as young predators found themselves competing with adults for increasingly scarce resources. The next generation of super predators was failing to develop the skills necessary for survival in the changing ocean environment. The sensory systems that had made these predators so effective were becoming liabilities as the ocean environment changed around them. Creatures that had evolved to detect specific chemical signatures were finding that their prey had altered their biochemistry to avoid detection. Predators that relied on electrical field detection were being confused by the electromagnetic defenses that their prey had developed. The most sophisticated hunting strategies that had taken millions of years to perfect were becoming useless as prey species learned to recognize and counter them. The psychological warfare that had been such an effective predatory tool was being turned against the predators as their victims became capable of manipulating predatory behaviors for their own survival. As the late Cretaceous period drew to a close, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic ecological transformations in Earth's history. The creatures that had ruled the seas with absolute authority were about to face challenges that would test every adaptation they had developed over millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The changing ocean chemistry of the late Cretaceous was beginning to affect the basic physiology of these super predators. Creatures that had evolved in warm, oxygen-rich seas were finding themselves struggling to function as global temperatures began to fluctuate and ocean composition started to shift. The very environment that had created these monsters was beginning to turn against them. The food webs that had supported these complex predatory ecosystems were showing signs of instability as climate patterns began to change. The reliable migration routes and breeding cycles that predators had learned to exploit were becoming increasingly unpredictable. The ancient oceans were entering a period of environmental chaos that would challenge every species to adapt or face extinction. But the most ominous sign of impending catastrophe was the increasing frequency of mass mortality events documented in the fossil record. Entire populations of apex predators were dying simultaneously, their bodies creating fossil graveyards that speak to ecological disasters of unprecedented scale. The perfect killing machines were proving vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The stage was set for an apocalypse that would end the age of marine super predators forever. The very seas that had nurtured these evolutionary marvels for over 100 million years were about to become their tomb. The reign of underwater terror was approaching its final moments, and when the end came, it would reshape the oceans in ways that continue to influence marine life today. The legacy of these prehistoric nightmares would endure long after their extinction, serving as a reminder of what happens when evolutionary arms races proceed without limits. They had proven that given enough time and the right conditions, life could create forms so perfectly adapted for destruction that they transcended normal biological boundaries. But they had also demonstrated that even the most successful predators are not immune to the forces of environmental change. As we prepare to witness the final chapter of this underwater reign of terror, we must remember that these creatures weren't just monsters from a distant past. They were products of the same evolutionary processes that continue to shape life today. Their story serves as both a testament to the incredible creativity of natural selection and a warning about the potential consequences of unchecked predatory escalation. The ancient oceans had been transformed into something that had never existed before or since. A three-dimensional battlefield where the capacity for violence had been elevated to an art form. The creatures that emerged from this crucible of competition were simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying products of evolution our planet has ever produced. But every empire, no matter how powerful, must eventually face its reckoning. The age of underwater nightmares was about to give way to something completely different, as the forces that had created these monsters finally turned against them. The end of their reign would be as spectacular and violent as their rise to power, setting the stage for the emergence of entirely new forms of marine life. The final battle between these evolutionary titans and the changing world around them was about to begin, and when the dust settled, the oceans would never be the same again. The echoes of their dominance would continue to haunt the depths for millions of years, but their time as rulers of the underwater realm was drawing to its inevitable close. The greatest predatory empire in Earth's history was about to learn that even perfect killing machines are not immune to the relentless march of time and change. Their story serves as both an inspiration and a warning, a reminder of what life can achieve when pushed to its limits and what happens when those limits are finally exceeded. The moment of reckoning arrived not as a single catastrophic event, but as a cascade of interconnected disasters that would bring the mightiest predators our planet had ever known to their knees. The very forces that had shaped these underwater titans for over 100 million years were about to turn against them with devastating finality. Climate change, real, dramatic, and utterly merciless, began to reshape the ancient oceans in ways that challenged every adaptation these super predators had developed. The warm, stable seas that had nurtured their evolution were giving way to a world of temperature fluctuations and chemical instability that would test the limits of even the most perfectly adapted killing machines. The oxygen levels that had sustained these massive predators began to plummet as ocean circulation patterns shifted dramatically. Creatures that had evolved in oxygen-rich environments suddenly found themselves gasping for breath in waters that could no longer support their enormous metabolic demands. The very act of being a super predator with all the energy requirements that entailed, became a liability in a world where every breath was a struggle. But the most insidious change was happening at the microscopic level, where the foundation of marine food webs was beginning to crumble. The phytoplankton that formed the base of oceanic ecosystems were dying off in massive numbers as ocean chemistry shifted beyond their tolerance levels. Without these microscopic organisms, the entire structure of marine life began to collapse from the bottom up. The effects of this ecological catastrophe rippled through every level of the food web with ruthless efficiency. The small fish that fed on plankton began to disappear, followed by the larger fish that preyed on them, and so on up the chain until even the mightiest apex predators found themselves facing starvation in seas that appeared abundant, but were actually barren of suitable prey. For creatures that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of killing, the irony was devastating. Their weapons remained as sharp as ever, their hunting instincts as refined as natural selection could make them, but there was increasingly little left to hunt. The ancient oceans were becoming aquatic deserts where even the most successful predators wandered endlessly in search of meals that no longer existed. The fossil record from this period tells a story of increasing desperation that would be heartbreaking if these creatures weren't such efficient killers. Bite marks on inappropriate prey items reveal predators attempting to feed on organisms they had never considered edible before. Creatures that had specialized in hunting large prey were making increasingly futile attempts to sustain themselves on victims barely large enough to provide a single meal. The sophisticated pack-hunting behaviors that had made some of these predators so effective began to break down as competition for scarce resources intensified. Former allies turned on each other with savage efficiency, their perfect killing instincts redirected toward members of their own species. The ancient seas witnessed civil wars between apex predators as survival became a zero-sum game where only the strongest individuals could hope to find enough food to survive. Evidence of cannibalistic behavior becomes increasingly common in the fossil record as traditional prey species disappeared entirely from many ocean regions. Creatures that had ruled their ecosystems for millions of years were reduced to scavenging the corpses of their own kind, their magnificent hunting abilities rendered useless by the collapse of the food webs they had dominated for so long. The reproductive cycles that had sustained these predator populations for countless generations began to fail as females found themselves unable to accumulate the massive energy reserves necessary for successful breeding. The next generation of super predators was simply not being born, as adult females either failed to mate entirely or absorbed their developing offspring to survive another day in the deteriorating ocean environment. The sensory systems that had made these creatures such effective hunters became sources of torment as they detected the chemical signatures of death and decay that now permeated their domain. Predators that had evolved to track the bioelectric fields of healthy prey found themselves following signals that led only to rotting carcasses and empty water. Their perfect adaptations had become instruments of false hope in a dying world. The territorial behaviors that had once allowed these apex predators to maintain exclusive hunting grounds broke down entirely as desperation overrode millions of years of evolutionary programming. Creatures that had never shared space with competitors found themselves forced into increasingly smaller areas where violent confrontations became inevitable. The ancient oceans echoed with the sounds of titans destroying each other in battles that no one could truly win. But even as these individual tragedies played out across the dying seas, a far greater catastrophe was building beyond the planet's atmosphere. The asteroid that would deliver the final blow to this underwater empire was already hurtling through space, carrying with it the power to end not just individual species, but entire evolutionary lineages that had seemed destined to rule the oceans forever. When that cosmic projectile finally struck the Earth, it unleashed forces that dwarfed even the most powerful predators the seas had ever known. The impact generated tsunamis that swept across entire ocean basins, carrying with them the broken bodies of creatures that had survived every challenge evolution could devise, only to be destroyed by physics on a planetary scale. The debris cloud that followed the impact blocked out the sun for months, plunging the oceans into darkness that made the deepest trenches seem bright by comparison. Photosynthesis stopped almost entirely, completing the collapse of marine food webs that had been teetering on the edge of failure for millions of years. The perfect killing machines found themselves in a world where there was literally nothing left to kill. The temperature fluctuations that followed the impact were beyond anything these creatures had ever experienced. Oceans that had been warm and stable for geological ages became thermal battlegrounds, where survival depended on the ability to adapt to conditions that changed faster than evolution could respond. The very environment that had created these monsters became hostile to their continued existence. Acid rain, generated by the impact's atmospheric effects, changed ocean chemistry so dramatically that many predators found themselves unable to maintain basic physiological functions. Creatures that had evolved to thrive in specific chemical conditions discovered that their perfectly adapted bodies had become prisons in a world where the basic rules of biochemistry had been rewritten overnight. The magnetic field disruptions caused by the impact interfered with the navigation systems that many of these predators had used to traverse the vast oceans in search of prey. Creatures that had migrated across entire ocean basins with unerring accuracy found themselves lost in their own domain, wandering aimlessly through waters that no longer provided the electromagnetic cues they had relied upon for millions of years. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this mass extinction was how it demonstrated the fundamental vulnerability that even perfect predators could never overcome. All their evolutionary refinement, all their sophisticated adaptations, all their deadly efficiency meant nothing when faced with forces that operated on scales beyond biological comprehension. The last of the great marine reptiles died not in glorious battle against worthy opponents, but slowly and quietly as their world dissolved around them. Creatures that had inspired terror across entire ocean basins passed away in silence, their magnificent bodies settling to the seafloor to become fossils that would puzzle future generations of scientists. The ichthyosaurs, with their perfect hydrodynamic forms and lightning-fast reflexes, found their speed useless in a world where there was nowhere to run and nothing to chase. The Mosasaurus, with their crushing jaws and massive size, discovered that power meant nothing when there was nothing left to overpower. The Plesiosaurs, with their serpentine necks and patient hunting strategies, learned that patience was a luxury in a world where time itself had run out. Even the most bizarre specialists, creatures like Helicoprion, with their impossible spiral jaws, found that their unique adaptations provided no protection against extinction. The evolutionary experiments that had seemed so successful for millions of years were revealed to be dead ends when the environment that had created them ceased to exist. The deep-sea trenches that had harbored the most extreme predators emptied as their inhabitants either starved or succumbed to the changing chemistry of their abyssal realm. Creatures that had seemed almost alien in their perfection proved to be as mortal as any other form of life when faced with planetary-scale catastrophe. The coastal waters that had been terrorized by massive crocodilians fell silent as the last of these armored nightmares found themselves unable to maintain their massive bodies in a world where prey had become a memory. The rivers and estuaries that had echoed with the sounds of their hunting activities became peaceful for the first time in millions of years. But the most profound silence came from the open oceans, where the greatest predators had once ruled with absolute authority. The vast blue expanses that had been theaters of constant warfare became empty stages where only the wind and waves provided any movement. The age of underwater nightmares had ended not with a roar, but with a whisper. Yet even in death, these creatures left behind a legacy that would influence the evolution of marine life for millions of years to come. The empty niches they vacated would eventually be filled by new forms of ocean life. But the ghost of their presence would haunt every evolutionary experiment that followed. The surviving species that inherited the post-extinction oceans carried within their genes the memories of their ancestors' encounters with these prehistoric terrors. Every defensive adaptation, every escape response, every instinctive fear of the deep water reflected millions of years of coevolution with predators that were literally designed for destruction. The mammals that would eventually return to the seas faced oceans that had been fundamentally shaped by the creatures that came before them. The whales and dolphins that populate our modern oceans evolved in the shadow of extinct giants, their own predatory strategies influenced by the selective pressures that their predecessors had created. Even today's apex predators, the great white sharks, the orcas, the giant squids, are pale reflections of the monsters that once ruled these waters. Modern marine ecosystems, dangerous as they might seem, operate under constraints that would have been laughable to the super-predators of the Mesozoic era. The maximum sizes achieved by modern marine predators are limited by the same factors that brought down their prehistoric predecessors: energy requirements, prey availability, and environmental stability. The oceans simply cannot support the kinds of evolutionary arms races that created the ancient monsters, at least not under current conditions. The hunting strategies employed by today's marine predators are sophisticated by modern standards, but would have been considered primitive by the standards of creatures that had refined the art of killing over hundreds of millions of years. The psychological warfare, the coordinated pack behaviors, the specialized anatomical weapons, all of these innovations died with their creators. The intelligence levels achieved by some prehistoric marine predators may have exceeded those of any modern ocean dweller. The complex social behaviors, the strategic planning abilities, the capacity for learning and adaptation that characterized the final generations of super predators represented evolutionary peaks that have never been reached again. But perhaps the most important legacy of these extinct monsters is the reminder they provide about the temporary nature of even the most successful evolutionary experiments. No adaptation, no matter how perfect, can guarantee survival in a world where change is the only constant. The creatures that seemed destined to rule the oceans forever were ultimately brought low by forces beyond their control. The fossil record they left behind serves as both inspiration and warning for modern life forms. It demonstrates the incredible heights that evolution can achieve when given sufficient time and selective pressure. But it also reveals the ultimate futility of arms races that push biological systems beyond sustainable limits. The ancient oceans had become so dominated by predators that they had essentially consumed themselves, creating a situation where even perfect killing machines could not find enough to kill. The lesson is clear. Success in evolution requires not just the ability to dominate, but the wisdom to know when domination has gone too far. Modern marine ecosystems, with all their apparent violence and competition, are actually models of restraint compared to the prehistoric seas. The predators that exist today have learned, through the harsh teacher of extinction, that sustainable predation requires balance rather than absolute dominance. The great marine reptiles are gone, but their influence continues to shape the oceans in ways both subtle and profound. Every wave that breaks upon our shores carries within it the memory of creatures so magnificent and terrible that they seem more like myths than historical reality. Yet they were real, and for over 100 million years they made the oceans their kingdom. Their reign ended in fire and ice, in darkness and chemical chaos and silence and extinction. But their legacy endures in every adaptation of modern marine life, in every defensive strategy of contemporary prey species, and in every limitation that constrains today's predators. They remind us that even the mightiest can fall, and that the only constant in evolution is change itself. The prehistoric oceans were indeed a pure nightmare horror, but they were also a testament to the incredible creativity and resilience of life itself. In waters that would have been instantly fatal to modern organisms, creatures evolved that pushed the boundaries of what was biologically possible. They created ecosystems so alien that they seemed to belong on another planet, yet they emerged from the same evolutionary processes that continue to shape life today. As we look out over our modern seas, we should remember that beneath their apparently peaceful surfaces lie the bones of creatures that once made these waters tremble with fear. The age of underwater nightmares is over, but the memory of their reign continues to haunt the depths, a reminder of what the oceans once were and what they might become again if the conditions were right. The story of prehistoric marine predators is ultimately a story about the power and limitations of evolution itself. It shows us what life can achieve when pushed to its absolute limits, and what happens when those limits are finally exceeded. It is a tale of triumph and tragedy, of success and failure, of creatures so perfectly adapted that they became victims of their own perfection. In the end, the most terrifying aspect of these ancient monsters may not be what they were, but what they represent. The potential for life to create forms so efficient at destruction that they threaten the very ecosystems that sustain them. They serve as a warning from the deep, a reminder that even perfect predators are not immune to the forces of change that govern all life on Earth. The reign of underwater terror has ended, but its echoes continue to reverberate through time, shaping the evolution of marine life in ways we are only beginning to understand. The prehistoric oceans may be gone forever, but their legacy lives on in every creature that swims beneath the waves, carrying forward the memory of an age when nightmares ruled the deep. The silence that followed the great dying was perhaps more terrifying than all the roars and screams that had preceded it. For the first time in over 100 million years, the oceans fell quiet. The endless symphony of predation that had echoed through every depth and current simply stopped, replaced by an eerie calm that would have been unrecognizable to any creature from the age of monsters. But nature abhors a vacuum, and the empty seas would not remain barren forever. In the depths, where the greatest nightmares had once prowled, new forms of life began to stir. These weren't the massive, armor-plated behemoths of the past, but smaller, more adaptable creatures that had learned the ultimate lesson of survival. Sometimes the meek truly do inherit the earth. The mammals that had cowered on land while marine reptiles ruled, the waves began their tentative return to the waters that had once been forbidden territory. These early pioneers were nothing like the streamlined killing machines they would eventually become. They were awkward, experimental creatures, testing the boundaries of an oceanic world that was still haunted by the ghosts of its former rulers. The first whales were barely recognizable as marine mammals, retaining legs and fur that spoke of their terrestrial origins. But they possessed something their prehistoric predecessors had lacked: the hard-won wisdom of survivors. They had learned from watching the downfall of the super predators that dominance without sustainability was merely a path to extinction. These early cetaceans developed hunting strategies that were almost conservative compared to the industrial-scale slaughter that had characterized the age of marine reptiles. They hunted in small groups, took only what they needed, and avoided the kind of specialized extremes that had made their predecessors so vulnerable to environmental change. The sharks that had somehow survived the Great Dying emerged into a world where they were suddenly among the largest predators in the sea. But they, too, had learned caution. The great whites and tiger sharks that would eventually rule modern oceans were shadows of the cartilaginous nightmares that had once shared the seas with ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs. Modern marine ecosystems began to take shape around principles that would have seemed alien to the prehistoric superpredators: cooperation efficiency, and most importantly, restraint. The new rulers of the ocean understood instinctively that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that the price of unchecked predation was extinction. The coral reefs that grew in the shallow waters of this new world created sanctuaries where smaller creatures could evolve without the constant threat of being harvested by massive predators. These biodiversity hotspots became laboratories for evolutionary experimentation, but experiments constrained by the memory of what happened when such experiments went too far. The deep ocean trenches, once home to the most bizarre and specialized hunters in Earth's history, slowly repopulated with creatures that seemed almost mundane by prehistoric standards. But their very ordinariness was their strength. They had learned to thrive without becoming so specialized that they couldn't adapt to changing conditions. The food webs that developed in these post-apocalyptic seas were marvels of balance and restraint. Predators evolved to be efficient without being wasteful, powerful without being destructive, successful without being suicidal. It was as if the entire marine biosphere had learned from the mistakes of its predecessors. Yet, even as life rebuilt itself in the empty oceans, the influence of the extinct monsters could still be felt. The defensive strategies developed by prey species during the age of super predators persisted long after their tormentors had vanished. Fish still schooled in patterns designed to confuse predators far larger than any that still existed. Marine mammals still dove to depths that seemed excessive for avoiding modern threats. The evolutionary memory of that age of terror lived on in the genes of every marine organism, passed down through millions of generations as a reminder of what the oceans had once been. Even today, when a great white shark approaches a seal colony, or when an orcapod coordinates an attack on a blue whale, we catch glimpses of the kind of predatory behavior that once dominated every corner of the ancient seas. But these modern echoes are pale reflections of the original nightmare. Today's apex predators operate under constraints that their prehistoric ancestors never knew. They must compete not just with other predators, but with environmental regulations written in the genetic code of every species that survived the Great Dying. The maximum sizes achieved by modern marine predators are carefully limited by these biological safeguards. No creature is allowed to grow so large that it threatens the stability of entire ecosystems. No hunting strategy is permitted to become so efficient that it eliminates its own prey base. The oceans have learned to regulate themselves in ways that prevent the return of the super predator arms race. Modern whales, despite being the largest animals ever to exist, are gentle giants that filter feed on tiny organisms. This isn't an accident. It's an evolutionary strategy that avoids the predatory escalation that doomed their predecessors. By choosing to feed at the bottom of the food web rather than the top, they found a way to achieve massive size without triggering the kind of ecological arms race that destroyed the ancient marine reptiles. The intelligence displayed by modern marine mammals is remarkable, but it's intelligence tempered by wisdom. Dolphins and whales have developed complex social behaviors and sophisticated hunting strategies. But they've also learned to recognize the limits of sustainable predation. They hunt cooperatively, but they also know when to stop. Even the most aggressive modern marine predators show restraint that would have been foreign to their prehistoric counterparts. Great white sharks are formidable hunters, but they're also surprisingly selective about their prey. They've learned through millions of years of evolution that indiscriminate killing is a luxury that no predator can afford for long. The fossil record of these post-extinction oceans tells a very different story from the one written by the age of monsters. Instead of escalating arms races and increasingly bizarre adaptations, we see stability, balance, and gradual refinement of sustainable strategies. The new marine ecosystems were built to last rather than to dominate. This doesn't mean that modern oceans are without their own forms of terror. The deep sea still harbors creatures that would seem alien to surface dwellers. Giant squids with eyes the size of dinner plates still battle sperm whales in the crushing depths. But even these encounters are governed by rules that prevent either species from gaining the kind of absolute advantage that characterized prehistoric predation. The bioluminescent creatures that populate the deep ocean trenches have developed some of the most sophisticated hunting strategies on the planet, but they are strategies designed for efficiency rather than maximum lethality. The anglerfish that lures prey with its hypnotic light could theoretically evolve more powerful lures. But evolutionary pressure has favored just enough effectiveness to survive, not enough to eliminate all available prey. The chemical warfare that characterizes many modern marine interactions is subtle compared to the industrial-scale poisoning that some prehistoric predators employed. Modern cone snails can deliver venom potent enough to kill a human, but they use it sparingly and only when necessary. The lesson of the ancient seas, that weapons too powerful ultimately destroy their wielders, has been learned at the genetic level. The migration patterns of modern marine animals still follow routes established millions of years ago, but they're routes that avoid the kind of predictable congregation points that prehistoric super-predators learned to exploit. Modern prey species have inherited the paranoia of their ancestors, maintaining escape routes and defensive behaviors that seem excessive for the threats they actually face. The reproductive strategies of modern marine predators show clear evidence of evolutionary learning from the mistakes of the past. Instead of producing large numbers of offspring and abandoning them to fend for themselves, most modern marine mammals invest heavily in raising small numbers of young to maturity. This strategy prevents the kind of juvenile cannibalism that characterized many prehistoric species. The social structures that govern modern marine predator populations are marvels of cooperative restraint. Orcapods have territories and hunting protocols that prevent overexploitation of prey resources. Wolf packs of the sea, they hunt with deadly efficiency, but also with careful attention to sustainable yield. Even the most solitary modern marine predators show behaviors that suggest they've internalized the lessons of the ancient extinction. Great white sharks, despite their fearsome reputation, are actually quite conservative hunters. They prefer easy prey and avoid unnecessary risks that might lead to injury or energy expenditure that can't be recovered. The sensory systems of modern marine predators are sophisticated but not overwhelming. They've evolved to be just sensitive enough to find prey efficiently without becoming so specialized that they can't adapt to changing conditions. The super senses that characterize many prehistoric species have been replaced by more balanced sensory suites that prioritize flexibility over maximum performance. The diving abilities of modern marine mammals are impressive by any standard, but their abilities developed within sustainable limits. Sperm whales can dive to crushing depths and hold their breath for over an hour, but they do so in ways that don't damage their physiology or require unsustainable energy expenditure. The extreme diving adaptations of some prehistoric species, which pushed their bodies to the absolute limits of what was biologically possible, have been replaced by more moderate capabilities that can be maintained throughout a normal lifespan. The hunting technologies employed by modern marine predators show clear evidence of evolutionary restraint. Dolphins use echolocation to navigate and hunt, but it's echolocation carefully calibrated to avoid the kind of sensory overload that might make them dependent on perfect acoustic conditions. The sonar systems of prehistoric marine reptiles may have been more powerful, but they were also more vulnerable to environmental disruption. Modern marine ecosystems operate on principles of redundancy and resilience that would have seemed foreign to the streamlined killing machines of the prehistoric seas. Multiple species fill similar ecological roles, ensuring that the collapse of any one predator species won't trigger the kind of cascading ecosystem failure that characterized the end of the age of monsters. The competition between modern marine predators is real but regulated by mechanisms that prevent the kind of escalation that doomed their predecessors. Species partition resources, avoid direct confrontation when possible, and have evolved behaviors that recognize the mutual benefit of coexistence over the Pyrrhic victory of total dominance. As we look out over our modern oceans, we see waters that are simultaneously familiar and alien to the creatures that once ruled them. The basic physics of marine life remain the same. Predators must still catch prey, escape responses must still be faster than attack speeds, and energy conservation still governs every aspect of behavior. But the psychological landscape of these waters has been fundamentally transformed. The modern ocean is a place where predators and prey coexist in a delicate balance that acknowledges the catastrophic potential of unchecked predatory evolution. It's a world where the memory of extinction serves as a constant reminder that survival requires not just the ability to kill, but the wisdom to know when killing becomes counterproductive. The greatest predators of our modern seas are powerful beyond the comprehension of most terrestrial creatures, but they're powerful within limits that their prehistoric predecessors never learned to respect. They've inherited a world where the price of absolute predatory success is written in stone, literally, in the fossil record of species that learned this lesson too late. The age of underwater nightmares may be over, but its influence continues to shape every aspect of marine life. From the schooling patterns of the smallest fish to the hunting strategies of the largest whales, the ghost of prehistoric terror continues to guide the evolution of oceanic life. The modern seas are haunted waters where every creature swims in the shadow of extinct giants. Perhaps that's as it should be. The memory of what the oceans once were serves as both warning and guide, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. The prehistoric seas may have been pure nightmare horror, but they were also the crucible that forged the wisdom that governs modern marine ecosystems. The story of these prehistoric oceans serves as the ultimate reminder that evolution, for all its creative genius, operates without foresight or moral compass. It doesn't care about balance, sustainability, or the long-term health of ecosystems. It only cares about immediate advantage, short-term survival, and the relentless pressure to outcompete everything else in your environment. For over 150 million years, this ruthless logic created an underwater arms race so intense that it pushed life itself to breaking point. The creatures we've encountered weren't aberrations or evolutionary mistakes. They were the inevitable result of natural selection operating without constraints, creating forms of life so perfectly adapted for violence that they became living embodiments of destruction itself. The most chilling aspect of this entire story isn't the individual monsters, terrifying as they were. It's the realization that these creatures represent what happens when evolution is given unlimited time and resources to perfect the art of killing. They show us the dark potential that lurks within every predator-prey relationship, waiting to be unleashed under the right conditions. Modern marine ecosystems exist in a state of carefully maintained tension, balanced on the edge of a knife between cooperation and competition. The genetic memory of the great dying ensures that no species pushes too hard, grows too large, or becomes too specialized. But that balance is fragile, maintained only by the constant pressure of evolutionary memory and environmental constraint. What happens if those constraints are removed? What if changing ocean chemistry, rising temperatures, or human interference disrupts the delicate equilibrium that keeps modern marine predators in check? The fossil record provides a terrifying answer. The monsters will return. Perhaps not in the same form, perhaps not with the same anatomy, but the underlying logic of predatory escalation remains unchanged. The oceans that surround us today are not peaceful by nature. They're peaceful by necessity, constrained by the hard-learned lessons of mass extinction. Beneath the surface of every modern marine ecosystem lies the potential for another age of monsters, waiting for the right conditions to emerge from the evolutionary shadows. This is the true legacy of the prehistoric seas, not just the memory of what was, but the warning of what could be again. The age of underwater nightmares may have ended 66 million years ago, but the forces that created those nightmares are still active, still shaping life in ways we're only beginning to understand. As we face an uncertain future of climate change, ocean acidification, and ecosystem disruption, we would do well to remember the lessons of the ancient seas. The prehistoric oceans weren't just a chapter in Earth's history. They were a preview of what happens when the natural world is pushed beyond its limits. The monsters are gone, but the potential for monsters remains. In every predator that swims our modern seas, In every evolutionary arms race that plays out in coral reefs and kelp forests, in every ecosystem under pressure from human activity, the ghost of prehistoric terror lurks just beneath the surface. The age of marine reptilian dominance may be over, but evolution never stops experimenting. Somewhere in the depths of our modern oceans, the next generation of apex predators is already taking shape, constrained for now by the memory of extinction, but ready to emerge if those constraints ever fail. The prehistoric seas were a pure nightmare horror, but they were also a mirror reflecting the darkest potentials of life itself. They remind us that beneath the beauty and complexity of the natural world lies a capacity for violence and destruction that defies comprehension. The age of underwater monsters may be finished, but the story of evolution's endless creativity, for better and for worse, continues to unfold in the depths around us. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying truth about the prehistoric oceans is not that they existed, but that they could exist again. The forces that created those ancient killing fields are still at work, still shaping life according to the same ruthless logic that once filled the seas with nightmares. The only thing standing between us and another age of marine terror is the fragile wisdom encoded in the genes of every creature that survived the great dying. That wisdom whispers a simple message across the millions of years since the last marine reptile drew breath. Never again. But evolution doesn't listen to whispers, and the ocean depths are vast and dark and full of possibilities we can barely imagine. The prehistoric seas may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every wave, every current, every creature that calls the ocean home. They remind us that the natural world is capable of wonders and horrors beyond our wildest dreams, and that the difference between the two is often nothing more than a change in perspective, or a change in conditions. The age of underwater nightmares has ended, but the potential for nightmares endures. In the endless blue depths of our modern oceans, evolution continues its experiments, constrained for now by memory and circumstance, but forever ready to unleash new forms of terror, should those constraints ever fail. The story of the prehistoric seas is ultimately a story about power, its potential, its limits, and its consequences. It's a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, that even perfect adaptation can become a prison, and that the only constant in the natural world is change itself. As we look toward an uncertain future, we carry with us the knowledge of what the oceans once were, and the sobering awareness of what they might become again. The prehistoric seas were indeed a pure nightmare horror, but they were also a teacher, showing us the price of unchecked ambition and the value of restraint. The monsters are gone, but their lesson remains. In the endless struggle for survival, victory and defeat are often separated by nothing more than the wisdom to know when enough is enough. The prehistoric oceans learned this lesson the hard way.